I didn't want any of it. That's the part nobody writes down in those old family scrolls my father keeps in the cedar chest under his bed. They write about duty. They write about the bloodline of Horus, about the covenant, struck 4,000 years ago in a desert, that nobody alive has walked, and nobody dead tell us about firsthand anymore, about how the children of our line will stand between humanity and the things that hunt it. They write it in the kind of language that's stone tablets, absolute, declarative, without room for revision. There is no room in the scrolls for the girl who just wants to pass her chemistry exam. I'm writing it now, so that someone who reads this later will know what the scrolls leave out. My father, Kenichiro Kami, is a middle manager at a company that makes industrial fasteners. He is 51 years old. He has a crease in his forehead that has been there since I was 7. A permanent line just above his right eyebrow that my mother says appeared. The winter he turned 30 and never left. He laughs too loudly at his own jokes. The punchline arrives, and then he does a second, louder laugh as if to make sure the first one registered. He burns the rice at least twice a week, because he starts cooking it and then gets distracted by something and forgets the pot is on. He is by every visible measure an ordinary man. The kind of ordinary that blends into the background of a crowded train car and doesn't leave a wake. 30 years he has been quietly, methodically fighting a war that no other human being on this planet knows is happening. A war that was already old when the century turned, and old when the century before that turned, and old when the world was organized into a shape that none of our maps would recognize. Things he fights are called Duatos. I want to be precise about what they are, because the word demon doesn't capture it, and the word monster doesn't either. Monsters are things that don't fit, oversized, obvious, wrong in a way that registers immediately and tells you to run. Duatos are not like that. They are old. Old the way stone is old. Old the way the deep ocean is old. Old the way something is old, when it has had 4,000 years to practice being a predator and has never once stopped and has never needed to change its fundamental approach. Because the fundamental approach keeps working. They move through the world like water moves through rock. Not dramatically, not with effort, but with the patience of something that knows it has more time than you do. They wear shapes. That's the part that matters for my purposes. And for yours, if you're reading this from some future vantage point that gives you the luxury of assessment I didn't have when I was living through it. A woman in a doorway. The flutter of something at the edge of a school roof. They learned, in those 4,000 years of practice, that the thing which frightens humans most is not the monster in the dark. The monster in the dark at least tells you where the threat is. The thing that frightens humans most is the neighbor who turns out not to be who you thought they were. The person inside the familiar frame who is operating on entirely different premises. My father knows what they are. He has always known. The bloodline of Horus. Whatever that means in genetic terms, whatever mechanism it operates through, and my father cannot explain it to me any better than I could explain it to someone else, carries a kind of recognition, a knowing that doesn't come from books or study. It sits in the marrow, he told me once. And it fires the moment you're close enough to something that doesn't belong. Not a smell, not a sound, not a visual cue, something deeper than any of those. The sensation of a wrong note in a piece of music you know very well. That's how he could spend 20 years walking into rooms where those things waited and walking back out. Most of the time, with nothing worse than bruises, he explained to my mother as gym injuries. He passed the marrow to me. I didn't know that yet. I didn't know any of it. Or rather, I knew, and was refusing to know, which is a different thing. He had told me 3 months before that's the events I'm describing, on a night when he came home from bleeding something he wouldn't show me and couldn't hide from me. He sat at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning and looked at his hands for a long time, and then told me what he was, and what our line was, and what that almost certainly meant for me. I had listened. I had said I understood. And then I had done something that is, in retrospect, both completely reasonable and entirely insufficient. I had decided not to engage with it until I had to. I'm a fast learner. I had been very deliberate about not learning this particular thing. Then, a new boss showed up at my father's office, and a new student showed up at my school, and both of those things turned out to be the same problem wearing two different faces. The new student's name was Kyoko Mamiya. She transferred in on a Wednesday in early autumn. I know it was Wednesday because I had gotten my chemistry exam back, and the grade was exactly what I'd feared. 63. And I was sitting in the second row thinking about whether 63 was survivable or whether I needed to fundamentally reconsider my study habits when the door slid open and the homeroom teacher brought her in. She was slight. There is a quality some people have of taking up less space than they actually occupy. Not timidity, not self-effacement, something more deliberate than either of those. Kyoko Mamiya had that quality. Dark hair, cut short on one side in a way that looked less like a style and more like a practical decision. A school uniform that fit with an exactness that suggested it had been measured twice. She stood at the front of the room and said her name and bowed and looked at nothing in particular. And I had the impression, not fully formed, not yet anything I could have articulated, that she was someone who had been told at some point what the rules of a place were and had decided to follow them precisely and no further. She sat 2 rows to my left. She didn't talk to anyone that first day. She watched. Not nervously, not with the performance of casual disinterest that new students sometimes deploy. She simply watched the way you watch when watching is the actual task. I noted her and moved on. I had other things on my mind. That same week, 3 students went missing. Not gone home early missing. Not skipped class missing. Not the kind of missing that produces a flurry of texts and resolves itself by dinner. Here in the morning, present at third period, not home that night, and not reachable by the morning after. The administration handled it with the brisk, paper-stacking urgency of people who are working very hard to believe in a conventional explanation. Ran away, personal troubles, family circumstances. The conventional explanations were available, and the administration reached for them with both hands. The teachers were less certain. Could see it in the way they moved through the corridors now. Faster, with that small tightening around the eyes that adults get when they're monitoring more than one channel of incoming information. The custodian, an older man named Hayashida, who had worked at the school for as long as anyone could remember, had started locking the utility rooms at noon, which he had never done before. I noticed these things because I notice things. That's not a boast. It's a side effect of having grown up in a house where the man across the breakfast table is fighting a secret war. You learn, without being taught, to read the small signals, the too flat expression, the too careful movement, truth, the door that gets locked in the middle of the day for no stated reason. My father came home 3 evenings that week, with the flat, careful look. On the 3rd evening, he told me, "Feeding pattern," he said, in the hallway outside my room, voice low enough that my mother's radio would cover it. "They're taking from the school. Young concentrated energy. It's what they use for acceleration. Building towards something. I've seen this before. How long ago? 1987. A middle school in Osaka." He paused. I stopped it, but I was younger then and in better condition. Held for longer. I looked at him. The crease in his forehead. The lines around his mouth that hadn't been there 5 years ago. 51 years old, which is not old by any ordinary measure, and is not young for someone whose body is asked to do what hazard form asks of it. "I'll handle it," he said. "You always say that." It's usually true. He went to bed. I stood in the hallway and felt the thing in my marrow do what it always does when a Duatos is nearby. Not nearby in space, in this case, but nearby in narrative, circling the edges of my knowledge like weather. And I did what I had been doing for 3 months. I ignored it. The next day, Sawamura Yuichi was attacked, and ignoring it stopped being a viable strategy. Sawamura Sensei was the art teacher. He was the kind of teacher who exists on the useful side of the line between passionate and ridiculous, and he had been pushing at that line for as long as he'd been teaching, which was apparently about 8 years. Long enough to know where the line was and which way he wanted to stay relative to it. He had hung student work in the corridor without permission and been reprimanded for it, and done the same thing the following semester with a different set of work. He had a habit of tilting his head when he looked at something he was thinking seriously about, like he was trying to find the angle that let him see it better. Half the girls in the class had some version of a crush on him. The abstract kind. The kind you have when you're 17 and someone Treat your work as though it matters. I was not in that half. I just liked his class and the way he talked about light. He was attacked in the corridor outside the faculty room at 3:40 in the afternoon. I know the exact time because I had stayed late in the art room to work on a charcoal drawing I'd been struggling with. A harbor at low tide, the light on the water in late afternoon, a problem of layering that I kept approaching incorrectly. And I heard something in the corridor that sounded wrong, loud wrong, quiet wrong, the specific absence of the ordinary sounds a school building makes when it's winding down for the day. Feet on stairs, distant conversation, the particular resonance of an empty classroom with its windows open. What I heard was a subtraction of those sounds, a silence that had taken their place. I put my pencil down. I have gone back to this moment many times. I had a choice, technically. The door of the art room was between me and whatever was making that silence. I could have stayed inside it, could have waited and listened, and made a rational assessment, and called my father, who was much better equipped, by any objective measure, to deal with what was in the corridor. Instead, I opened the door. The thing that had Saomura-sensei pressed against the wall looked, from a distance, like a woman. Took 3 running steps toward it before the close-up resolved, and I understood what I was seeing. A scorpion's architecture wearing a woman's shape. The body mostly correct, the proportions nearly right, but the hands were wrong. Jointed at too many points, and the face was assembled incorrectly in a way that was harder to specify but impossible to miss once you had. The smell came at me at the same moment as the visual, a smell of deep water and old things. Of something that has been wet. For so long the wetness has become structural. It looked at me. Its eyes, which were not the right shape for a human face, tracked me with the interest of a predator that has just been surprised to find a second piece of food in what it expected to be an empty room. The marrow didn't stir, it moved. It moved the way an avalanche moves. Not building toward momentum, but already at full momentum. The decision made somewhere below consciousness. Transformed, my father calls it hazard form. The word is correct but inadequate. What happens is not a costume change. It's not the flare and sparkle of old comic book panels. What happens is more like a door being opened that you didn't know was in the house. And what comes through the door is something that has been on the other side for a long time, waiting with the patient certainty of something that knows it will eventually be needed. The armor materializes as an expression of what's underneath rather than as an addition to it. Circular, attached at the back, the Gasselschlent that my father carries a version of and has not fully mastered since his body started to go, comes with it. I am small in hazard form. I am exactly as physically small as I am out of it. This is something people who fight Duatos learn to use. The size reads as harmless, right up until it doesn't. The Scorpion Duatos recalibrated when it registered the transformation, but it had been hunting at the level of a tired middle-aged man in a rumpled suit. And I was not that. And it had a fraction of a second to revise its understanding of the situation before I made the revision moot. It was fast. 20 seconds. The Gasselschlent arcing back in the Rosetta Schent. The throw that cuts on the way out, and again on the return, if your timing is precise. I made it precise. The Duatos came apart the way they do when they're finished. Not like a body breaks under force, but like a pattern fails when its organizing logic is removed. The unraveling is very fast. Then the corridor was ordinary colored and quiet. Saomura-sensei slid down the wall and sat on the floor. I changed back before he could focus his eyes. By the time he could look at me, I was Asukami in a school uniform, standing in the corridor with my art supplies under my arm, which was implausible but less implausible than the alternative. I helped him up. I told him he'd fainted, which was not a story that fully accounted for anything he may have seen in the 3 seconds between the Duatos arriving and my engaging it. But it gave his mind a scaffold to build a conventional explanation on. And people who want a conventional explanation are very resourceful about constructing one. He thanked me. He went to the faculty room. I went back to the art room and sat in front of the harbor, drawing for 20 minutes without touching it. And I thought about how the marrow had moved before I decided. And what that meant for the question I'd been avoiding. It meant I didn't actually have a choice. That's what it meant. I called my father. He Listen to the whole account without interrupting, which is how he listens when something is serious. When I finished, there was silence long enough that I thought the call had dropped. I was hoping you'd have more time, he said. The marrow didn't ask. No, it doesn't. A pause. How do you feel? I thought about that honestly. Not scared. Not thrilled. Something that didn't quite fit either category. A kind of post-fact clarity. The feeling of having run a calculation and gotten a definite answer to a problem that had been unresolved for 3 months. Clear, I said. I feel clear. He was quiet again. I need to tell you something. Tomorrow. In person. Another pause. Asuka. You were right not to be afraid of this. You don't know that yet. I know you a little, he said. Shh. I know that. He came to the school the next morning in his work clothes, having arranged something with the vice principal that I was not privy to. I watched him come through the front gate and thought about what it would look like to someone who didn't know him. A middle-aged man in a slightly rumpled suit, unhurried, unremarkable, the kind of person who exists in the background of any given scene. He walked the perimeter of the school building twice, slowly, hands in his pockets, looking at nothing in particular, which was how he looked when the marrow was active, and he was reading what it told him. He came to find me at lunch in the courtyard, and he sat across from me and opened his thermos of coffee. He always brings his own, the school vending machine coffee being apparently beyond his standards. And he told me about the shadow. He had seen it the previous night. A figure on the rooftop of the building across the street from our house, standing in a position that made no practical sense for a human being at that hour. Too still, too patient, watching in a direction that turned out to be exactly toward our front door. He had recognized it not from its appearance. He'd seen nothing like it before, but from the marrow. The same deep register alarm that fires for Duatos, but different. A different key. Not the wrong note sensation, but something more complex. Something that carried information about orientation and intent, rather than simple presence. Shadow lineage, he said. Another bloodline, another covenant. The records are old and incomplete. This is something practitioners of our line rarely encounter directly, but the tradition describes them. Dark mirror. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. That gesture he makes when he's thinking through something he's uncertain about. Where we carry Horus, they carry another god. Different architecture, different mandate, but not opposed to ours, parallel to it. Parallel meaning they're also fighting the Duatos? Their relationship with the Duatos is different from ours. More complicated. The Dark Mirror tradition, as I understand it, doesn't engage directly with the same ongoing war. They observe, they record, they act at specific thresholds. There are conditions under which their mandate permits action, and conditions under which it prohibits it. He drank his coffee. If one of them has crossed into active engagement, something changed the conditions. He looked at me. That look I kept catching, the one with something in it I hadn't seen there before. Something moving underneath the flat, careful surface. Yes, the question is what? We ate our lunches in the courtyard. 2 rows away, at another table, Kyoko Mamiya ate alone with her bento closed in front of her and her attention on the middle distance. I watched her and thought about the week she had spent watching me from 2 rows to the left. And I thought about the kind of person who can watch and gather information in a room full of ordinary people, without the ordinary people noticing they're being watched. I noticed. It had taken me 4 days, but I noticed. The new student, I said. My father followed my sightline. He was quiet for a moment, and I saw the marrow recognition move across his face. Not the wrong note alarm, but the more complex signal, the parallel register. Yes, he said. When were you going to tell me? This morning. He put down his coffee. She was on the roof. She followed me here. She's been watching you since she arrived, which means she identified you before she arrived. He looked at Kyoko's still profile. She's not a threat in the way the Duatos are a threat. She is something, and I don't know precisely what, and I wanted to be honest with you about that. She's still here. Yes, she enrolled in my school. She goes to class. She eats her lunch. I thought about the geometry in the notebook margins, shapes that looked almost functional. She's not just watching, she's deciding something. My father nodded slowly. That's my reading as well. The decision Kyoko Mamiya was making revealed itself the following afternoon. in the east stairwell, in a sequence I have replayed more times than is probably useful. I was on my way to the third floor, 12:15, with my bento box because I had left something in the art room. The stairwell was empty when I entered it and contained a Duatos. By the time I reached the second floor landing, this one was a serpentine configuration. Cobra architecture scaled to human size. Wearing a school blazer that didn't fit quite right across the shoulder structure, moving from the landing above at a speed that registered before I could consciously categorize what I was seeing. Reached for hazard form. The Marrow responded. But the response and the Duatos were in a race, and the Duatos was closer to the start line. Something black moved faster than both of us. Freya. That's the name the records give the shadow lineage transformation, though I didn't know it yet, landed between me and the Cobra Duatos, with a sound that I can only describe as conclusive. Not loud, definitive, the sound of a decision becoming a physical fact. She was in armor that followed the same logic as mine but inverted. Same lines running in different directions, same circular blade, at the back but dark where mine catches light. She was the same height I am. Possibly slightly smaller, she was still for 1 second. In that second I saw her face, Kyoko Mamiya's face. Dark eyes and the short, asymmetric hair, and the expression that was neither neutral nor hostile, but something more precise than either. The expression of someone who has already done the calculation and is simply wait for the situation to catch up with the answer. She fought the Cobra Duatos in 40 seconds and made it look like 40 seconds was more than enough. The Gassel Shent equivalent at her back moved the way mine had moved against the Scorpion. That cutting arc, out and back, but with a specificity of execution that made my own technique look like a first draft. Cobra Duatos came apart. The stairwell was ordinary again. Then she turned and looked at me. I was still in my school uniform. Transformation had not completed. The shock of the sequence, the cobra, and the black figure and the face, had interrupted the Marrow's momentum in a way I hadn't expected and couldn't account for. I was standing with my bento box, which I had somehow maintained my grip on throughout, looking at a person who had just destroyed a 4,000-year-old predator in 40 seconds, and was now regarding me with an expression I could not read. She looked at me for 3 full seconds. Then, she stepped back into the shadow at the top of the landing, and was not there anymore. Not transformed, not departed in any conventional sense. Simply gone. The way a reflection disappears when you step away from the mirror. I sat down on the stairwell steps and breathed carefully for a while. Above me, the fluorescent light buzzed with the particular frequency of institutional lighting that has been burning too long. The bento box was still in my hand. I set it on the step beside me and looked at it. My mother's tamagoyaki in precise rectangles, lid closed against whatever had just happened in this stairwell. And I felt the gap between the ordinary container and the fact of what I was very clearly, and without drama, not 2 separate lives. One life that contained both of those things at the same time. That was a new understanding. Not comfortable, but accurate. My father, when I called him, was quiet for longer than usual. I counted his silence and breaths. She engaged directly, he said, against the Duatos. And then she looked at me like she was making a decision about something. Not like she was deciding whether to attack. Like she was deciding whether to, I stopped. Whether to what? I don't know. That's the part I couldn't read. Assessment, he said. What that sounds like. Assessment of what? That's the question. He paused again. What she did in the stairwell, intervening directly against a Duatos to protect you, that's not a shadow lineage baseline behavior. That's not what the dark mirror tradition mandates, which means she made a choice that went beyond her mandate. People make choices outside their mandates all the time. People do, he said. Yes. He said it in the voice he uses when something has surprised him in a direction he's cautiously glad about. Come home. We need to talk about tomorrow. Tomorrow was the day we went into the basement. My father had been tracking the Duatos staging pattern for 3 days. Pattern he identified was not random. It was architectural. The way a cell structure is architectural. Everything oriented toward a center point. The center point was in the basement of the school's east wing, the pre-renovation section that still had the feel and smell of the decade it was built in. He'd crossed the perimeter twice, reading the marrow signal from the outside. And the signal was strong enough that he could map the arrangement without going in. 7 cells minimum, possibly 9. The evening before we went in, my father sat at the kitchen table after dinner with a cup of tea he didn't drink and said things I had been waiting, without knowing I was waiting, to hear him say. My mother was in the other room with the television on. He spoke in the particular register he's been using for years whenever he has to say something real at the kitchen table. Just above the threshold of the television noise. Just below the threshold of anything my mother would consciously register. I want to tell you something before tomorrow, he said. All right. He turned the teacup around in his hands. The year you were born, there was a staging event in Yokohama. Larger than what we're looking at now. 4 sustained cells, interlocked, running for almost 3 weeks before I identified the center point. He looked at the cup. I went in alone. It took 4 hours. Afterward, I couldn't hold the form again for 6 weeks. And during those 6 weeks, I was diminished. In every sense. Were you afraid? I asked. He looked at me. Yes. What did you do with it? I held the form anyway. The fear was accurate. It was telling me something true about the situation. Accurate information doesn't tell you what to do with it. You still have to decide. He set the cup down. The fear I had going into Yokohama was the same fear I had when you were an infant, and I understood what the bloodline meant for you. Fear was also accurate, also true. He paused. I spent 17 years trying to decide what to do with it. What did you decide? He looked at me for a long moment, with the expression I had been seeing more frequently, the one with something unnamed in it, something that had been sealed for a long time, and was now quietly admitting air. That you are not the thing I need to be afraid for, he said. That you are the thing the Duatos should be afraid of. I just needed to wait long enough to see it. I didn't say anything. There was nothing that wouldn't have been smaller than the moment required. We sat at the kitchen table for another few minutes and listened to the television in the other room. Then he went to bed, and I washed the teacup. And I stood at the kitchen sink for a while, with the water running, and thought about Yokohama and the 6 weeks after, and the 17 years of deciding. Then I went to bed too, and I slept without difficulty, which surprised me. 7 cells, minimum. Possibly 9. The missing students, he said. They'll be inside the staging area, probably unharmed. The Duatos use living energy, which means keeping the source alive until they've completed the accumulation. We need to move before the cycle closes. What happens when the cycle closes? He looked at his coffee cup. They use what they've accumulated. Whatever it enables, a larger incursion, a transit event, something worse than what we've seen. It happens. Reversing it after the fact is much harder than preventing it before. So we go in. You go in. I'll be with you. He set down the cup. But Asuka, there's a realistic chance that I can't hold the form for the full engagement. My body. He stopped. He started again. The endurance is not what it was. I need you to understand that going in. I looked at him. The crease in his forehead. Careful hands around the cup. I understand, I said. He nodded. He didn't say anything else about it, which was right. There's a kind of acknowledgement that requires only itself and gets heavier with additional words. We went into the basement at 2 in the afternoon. The space was large, the way old institutional basements are large. Ceilings higher than necessary, pipes running overhead, the residue of several decades of storage decisions visible in the shapes stacked along the walls. Dark, but not entirely. The Duatos don't need light, but the students they'd taken in did, and there was a weak glow from somewhere at the far end that was just enough to see by. The students were in a circle in the center of the room. 11 of them, including the 3 who had been missing for a week, were sitting upright, eyes open, with that particular vacancy I'd seen in Sawamura-sensei's face. The expression of a person who has decided, at a cellular level, not to process what is happening to them. They were breathing. They were present in the narrowest sense of the word. The Duatos were arranged around them like a perimeter, and they were not surprised to see us. That was the first thing I registered. They had been expecting us, or something like us, or something they had evaluated us as equivalent to. 7 visible. Others, in the deeper shadows. My father transformed first. I have watched Pharaon emerge from Kenichiro Kami 3 times now, and it does not become less striking. The weariness leaves him. It's the most dramatic part, more dramatic than the armor or the mask. The weariness simply vacates the body, and what remains is the thing that has been at war for 30 years. The gold and white figure with the eye of Horus on its forehead, moving with the precision of something that knows exactly what it is. He took the first 3 before they could reconfigure. The 100-legged broad-bodied one went first. Then 2 of the chitinous smaller forms that had been building toward his left flank. He moved them the way someone clears a table of objects, efficiently, without sentiment, because the table needs to be cleared. Then the remaining Duatos did what Duatos do when they've been watching a particular warrior for decades. They adapted. 4 remaining, and they moved to separate us. 2 drawing my father toward the far wall, and 2 driving toward me with the intent of using me as leverage. I engaged. The mantis form was the one I hadn't encountered before. Where the cobra had been fast, the mantis was patient. Those articulated limbs fold in ways that make the creature seem smaller than it is, and then extend at a speed that doesn't correspond to anything visible in the folded position. Struck twice in the first 5 seconds. The first strike I avoided by virtue of the marrow's faster-than-thought response. The second caught me across the shoulder and put me into the wall hard enough to feel it through the armor, which is saying something. I got up. That is the whole of my father's actual combat instruction to me, delivered in the hallway outside my room on the night he told me what we were. When you're knocked down, you get up. The marrow will handle most of it. You just have to keep choosing to stand up. That's the human part of it. I recalibrated. Rosetta Shent, timing against the mantis, was different from the scorpion. The mantis was faster, and its attack pattern was less linear, more angular, harder to predict the return path. Feinted left, drew the extension, and sent the arc on the countercycle. The timing was a fraction short of what I needed, and I corrected it in flight, which I didn't know I could do, and the cut landed correctly, and the mantis came apart. The cobra had been waiting for the mantis to finish. Saw the mantis didn't finish. It came in at angle I hadn't fully anticipated, and I caught its strike on the flat of the blade by instinct rather than calculation. And the redirect worked, and I didn't understand precisely how, and it didn't matter. Then my father made a sound. I knew what the sound was before I turned. He had been, in form, for 9 minutes, which was 2 minutes beyond what he'd managed in the engagement 3 weeks ago, that had put the lines under his eyes. The sound was the sound of a body running past its own margins, not pain, exactly, but the specific noise of a mechanism that has exceeded its design tolerances, and is telling you so. He was still standing. He was still fighting. The 2 Duatos that had been driving him toward the far wall had made the calculation, and the calculation was correct. He was at his limit. They turned from him and moved toward the center of the room, which meant toward the students and toward me, and between us was a distance I was not going to close in time. I understood this with the mathematical clarity that the marrow provides in high-stakes moments. It doesn't panic. It assesses. The assessment was insufficient. Black landed in front of my father. Freya did not come from any visible direction. She was not there, and then she was. Present in the way a shadow is present when the light angle changes. There because the conditions for it were now right. She stood between my father's compromised form and the 2 converging Duatos in the black armor, the dark blade low and ready, and she was perfectly, entirely still. The Duatos stopped. They know what the dark lineage is. 4,000 years of institutional memory about both covenants. And whatever that memory said about the Shadow Angel, it said enough to make them pause. I have thought about this since what exactly they know about Freya's lineage that I don't. I think what they know is very old and very simple. The Shadow Mandate is bounded, limited, conditional, except when it isn't. Except when the conditions shift. And when the conditions shift and the Shadow Angel decides to act, she acts without the constraints that our covenant carries. Without the rules of engagement that have accumulated over 4,000 years of fighting the same war in the same way. She acts in a different register entirely. The Duatos came anyway. They always come. Whatever they know about the dark lineage, it doesn't change the fundamental equation. They have been doing this for 4,000 years. And the alternative to coming is not coming. And the Duatos don't have a mode for not coming. What Freya and I did together in the next 90 seconds, I cannot fully describe because I don't have the correct framework for it. We have never spoken more than a sentence to each other. We share no planning, no communication, no shared history of coordination. What we share, I think, is the marrow, not identical marrow, but related. The same old thing in different keys. What I know is that we did not collide. That when I went left, she went right without my saying anything. That when the Duatos tried to exploit the gap between us and found there was no gap, I could feel the moment they recognized there was no gap. A shift in the pattern of their movement, something between surprise and a kind of recalculation. The room went from 7 active Duatos to 0 Duatos in 90 seconds. And at no point during those 90 seconds did either of us hinder the other. When it was over, the students came back to themselves in stages. The coming back is gradual. The vacancy leaves their faces the way sleep leaves a face. Not all at once, but layer by layer, like a fog burning off. The eyes focus. Then the expression reassembles. Then the awareness of where they are, which produces the next thing, which was, for most of them, quiet crying that they didn't seem to be able to account for. They sat in the circle and looked at the room and at each other and couldn't remember how they'd gotten there. My father was sitting against the wall, with his eyes closed and his breathing deliberate and careful, the kind of breathing you do when you're taking inventory of your own condition. He was back, in his rumpled suit. The form had vacated when his body called it back. I was standing in my school uniform in the center of the room. Freya was in the corner. She had stepped back into the shadow at the edge of the room, but she hadn't left. She was still in the armor, the black mirror, watching. Not the students. Not my father. Me. I walked toward her. I don't know what I thought I would say. I know that the marrow had an opinion about the walk, and the opinion was that this was the right direction to go, and I have learned, grudgingly, incompletely, still learning, to trust the marrow's directional sense. She let me approach. I'll make note of that, because it was a choice. She could have stepped back into whatever shadow she inhabits between engagements. She stayed. I stopped 3 meters from her. The basement was quiet behind me, the students murmuring, my father breathing. I looked at her face. Kyoko. Mamiya's face, which I had been looking at from across a classroom for a week while she looked back at me, both of us gathering information the other probably knew we were gathering. I said. She didn't answer right away. I waited. The waiting felt right. She was deciding how to say something that didn't fit cleanly into the shape of words, and rushing it would only produce a less accurate answer. Parameters changed, she said. Voice was low and careful, and carried the particular precision of someone speaking a language they know extremely well, but have rarely had occasion to use aloud. Duatos exceeded the acceleration threshold. Yes, when the staging reaches a certain level, the shadow mandate no longer prohibits direct intervention. They reached that level. She paused. I was within my mandate. I acted. The stairwell. She didn't answer immediately. The stairwell was before the threshold, I said. Yes, so that wasn't required. She looked at me for a moment. Expression did not change in any way I could classify. But something shifted behind it. Something I could not name but could recognize. The sensation of a calculation completing. No, she said. It was not required. I thought about Sawamura-sensei, who had hung my work in the hallway without asking permission and been reprimanded for it, and done the same thing the following semester. I thought about my father against the wall. I thought about the 90 seconds, when 2 people who had never spoken moved without collision. You did it anyway, I said. She looked at me for 3 full seconds. The same measuring look, the same distance calculation. And then something in her expression resolved. Not into warmth, exactly. Into something more like a decision, acknowledged. The kind of expression a person has when they've been running a calculation for a long time and have finally reached the answer and are looking at the answer and deciding whether to say it aloud. She didn't say it aloud. She didn't need to. The answer was already visible in the fact that she was standing there at all. In the stairwell, in this basement, in the school, 2 rows to my left, for a week before any of this started. The answer was in all of those. She stepped back into the shadow and was gone. I stood in the center of the basement room for a moment. The students were crying softly behind me. My father was breathing with care against the wall. The room smelled of old concrete and the particular absence that the Duatos leave behind. Not a smell exactly, but the removal of somethings, the way a space feels after a window is closed against weather. You didn't realize you'd been smelling until it stopped. I thought about what she had said. The parameters changed. The mandate permitted. The stairwell was not required. Shh. I thought about the geometry she drew in her notebook margins. The shapes that looked almost functional. Someone had taught her those shapes. Or she had taught herself. Or they had come through the marrow the same way the Gassel-Shent technique comes through mine. Inherited knowledge from a lineage that goes back to a covenant with a different god. In a different desert. In a different century. Parallel war. A parallel obligation. A girl who sat in classrooms and watched and made her calculations. The same way my father had spent 30 years, walking into rooms full of Duatos and walking back out, quietly and without recognition. Different version of the same thing. I turned around and looked at my father. She's not an enemy, I said. No, he said. I don't think she is. We got the students to the nurse's office and assembled the plausible story about a gas leak in the basement. Plausible enough for the purpose of giving people's minds a conventional scaffold to build on. The ones who were most disoriented got sent home early. The administration held a meeting. The school sent a notice home. Hayashida, the custodian, who had been found in the supply closet off the gymnasium 2 days ago, with no memory, and the wrong look in his eyes, seemed fractionally steadier by the following week. Though he still locked the utility rooms at noon, and I suspected he would do so for the rest of his years at the school. My father drove home ahead of me. He drove slowly. I know because I passed the car from the bus stop on the corner and saw him at the wheel, not moving yet, both hands resting on top of it, looking at nothing through the windshield. He sat like that for almost 2 minutes before he put it in gear. I didn't knock on the window. Some things need their 2 minutes. I stayed late in the art room. The harbor drawing was almost done. The light on the water was still giving me trouble. That specific quality of late afternoon sun on still water, the way it seems to come from beneath the surface as much as from above. The layering problem I'd been working around for 2 weeks. I sat in front of it and tried to see clearly what I'd been doing wrong. Problem was that I'd been treating the surface and what was beneath it as separate problems. The light on still water is not two things. It's one thing. The interaction between the depth and the surface, the way the depth shapes what the surface reflects, the way the surface reveals what the depth contains. You can't paint them separately and combine them afterward. You have to hold both truths simultaneously. I looked at the drawing for a while. Then I picked up my pencil and started on the correction. Sawamura-sensei came by on his way out. He had a different quality these days, still enthusiastic, still prone to the tilted head assessment, but with something additional that was harder to name, kind of peripheral awareness, the awareness of someone who has looked at something at the edge of their vision and decided not to look at it directly, but also not to entirely stop seeing it. He looked at the drawing. He was quiet for almost a minute, which is a long time for Sawamura-sensei. Getting the depth right, he said. I'm trying. It's harder than the surface. People stop at the surface. He looked at it for another moment. You're not stopping at the surfaces. He left. I kept working. Most people stop at the surface. He didn't mean just the drawing. Kyoko Mamiya came to school the next morning. She sat 2 rows to my left and watched the front of the room and answered questions correctly. At lunch she went to the courtyard and opened her bento and ate alone. I sat across from her. She looked at me. The measuring look, the assessment, the calculation of distances. You're still here, I said. Yes. The threshold is cleared. The staging is gone. Your mandate. I thought about how to say it. Your mandate is satisfied. Yes. A crow landed on the wall behind her and looked at us with its head cocked. In the courtyard, some younger students were arguing about something, with the enthusiastic inaccuracy of people who are confident and wrong. A very ordinary afternoon in the middle of an ordinary school day. You're not leaving, I said. She picked up her chopsticks. She considered her bento for a moment. The parameters may change again, she said. I sat with that for a moment, thought about what the parameters were. The war that has been running for 4,000 years. The Duatos that have never stopped and will not stop. The covenant that I inherited from my father, who inherited it from his father, all the way back to something that happened in a desert that nobody alive remembers. I thought about a shadow lineage with a parallel mandate and a different god and rules of engagement I don't fully understand, and a girl who went beyond those rules in a stairwell because she decided to. Parameters may change, that's what she said. What she meant was, I am deciding to be here. All right, I said. We ate our lunches. The crow watched for a while and then lost interest and left. This is what I know now, sitting on the other side of it. Looking back at the girl in the second row, with her 63 on the chemistry exam, and her harbor drawing, and her deliberate, careful refusal to engage with what she was. The surface of my life is ordinary. The chemistry exams, and the bento lunches, and the corridor where my drawing hangs between a watercolor of the mountains and a charcoal portrait of someone's grandmother, the kitchen and my mother's precise tamagoyaki, my father's badly timed jokes, the way the bitstilling sounds when it winds down at the end of the day, that specific texture of ordinary life, resuming around the places where extraordinary things have happened. These things are not a disguise for other life. They are not a mask, not a performance, not the false surface of a double life. They are equally real, equally present, equally mine. I live both of them. Both of them are true. The girl who sat in the second row and ignored the marrow for 3 months was also real. She was not wrong to want the ordinary version of things. The wanting was honest. The wanting was appropriate. It just wasn't the variable that mattered. What mattered was what happened when the marrow moved and she moved with it. What happened in the corridor outside the faculty room? Happened in the stairwell and in the basement in the 90 seconds when two people who had never spoken moved without collision through a room full of things that had been hunting their bloodlines for 4,000 years. Those moments were also real. The girl in the second row was capable of those moments. She didn't know that yet. Now she does. Underneath the surface there is the light. The covenant is 4,000 years old. The Duatos are patient. The way stone is patient and have never stopped and will not stop because we ask them to. Father's body is 51 years old and carrying the weight of 3 decades of a war that has no off-season, and there will come a day, not soon, but not as far away as I'd like, when he can no longer hold the form. And what that means for the war is that I will hold it instead, and what that means for me is simply what it means. I am not in a position to be afraid of it. I am in a position to be ready for it. I can be ready. This is not the confidence of someone who does know what she doesn't know. I know I have a great deal to learn. I know the Duatos have 4,000 years of practice that I do not have. She both know my father can still teach things I haven't encountered yet, and that there are things I will have to teach myself because he won't be there to teach them. I know the form is still imprecise in ways that will cost me if I let them. What I also know is this. When the marrow moved in the corridor outside the faculty room, it moved because it recognized the situation and knew what to do. The knowing was in me before I had the words for it. The covenant is not a contract signed by one person on behalf of another. It's a thing that lives in the blood and passes forward. And what it passed forward into me is real and present and not going anywhere. And I will not carry it alone. This is the part that the old scrolls could not have predicted. The part outside the parameters of the records, my father keeps in the cedar chest. A shadow lineage angel with dark eyes and a precise appetite for information, who sat 2 rows to my left for a week and made her calculations and decided, on the basis of those calculations and something else that is harder to name, decided that the stairwell mattered, that the basement mattered, that what came next mattered. Who made choices that were not required by her mandate, which means they were choices she made for her own reasons. And those reasons belong to her, and I don't claim to fully know them. But I know what I saw in those 3 seconds of assessment, in the corridor of the stairwell and the corner of the basement. I saw someone who was deciding whether a distance was worth crossing. She crossed it. The war between our bloodlines and the Duatos is 4,000 years old, and it will not end in my generation. The Duatos do not end. You don't defeat something that old with a single battle in a school basement. You hold the line, and you hold it again, and you hold it again after that. That's the whole of the covenant. When you strip away the stone tablet language, hold the line. My father drives home every evening and burns the rice twice a week. He sits at the dinner table with my mother and laughs too loud at his own jokes and carries 30 years of a secret war in the crease above his eyebrow. And he has done this without complaint or recognition or the possibility of explanation, because the covenant asks for all of it and offers nothing in return except the knowledge that you held the line on the days when the line needed holding. I will do the same. I will do it differently, younger. And with things to learn that he had to learn the same way. And without his specific endurance, which is considerable, and with things I have that he didn't have at 17, I will make mistakes he didn't make. I will learn things from those mistakes. The war does not forgive mistakes, but the war does not care about your learning curve either. It proceeds at its own pace regardless, and you proceed at yours. And the overlap between those two paces is what you have to work with. Kyoko Mamiya comes to school every day now. She sits 2 rows to my left and watches the front of the room and answers questions correctly when called on. And then she goes quiet. At lunch, she eats alone in the courtyard on most days, and on some days I sit across from her and we eat in the kind of silence that doesn't require filling. We have not had another conversation like the one in the basement. We haven't needed to. What needed to be said was said, and what didn't need to be said is still present between us. The shared experience of those 90 seconds. The marrow-level recognition of someone who moves in the same register you do, even if the key is different. She draws in her notebook margins still. The geometry that looks almost functional. I looked up at her during a lecture last week, and she was drawing. And she glanced up at the same moment, and our eyes met, and she didn't look away, and neither did I. And after a few seconds, she went back to her drawing, and I went back to my notes. And that was the whole of it, and it was enough. I think about my father's 30 years sometimes. I think about the Yokohama staging event in the year I was born. 4 hours alone in a basement, 6 weeks of diminishment afterward, 20 years of walking into rooms full of Duatos, and walking back out while my mother ran her laundry and listened to the radio and didn't know. The weight of that carried alone, in the flat, careful expression that gives nothing away, in the jokes timed slightly off, in the rice burning twice a week because the man cooking it is somewhere else for a moment, processing something that happened in a room my mother will never know about. He won't carry it alone anymore either. I am here. And if the shadow lineage holds, if Kyoko Mamiya's calculations continue to arrive at the same answer they've been arriving at, then we are 2, and 2 is different from 1 in ways that matter more than arithmetic. The Duatos don't know what to do with 2. They found out in the basement. They'll find out again. I finished The Harbor drawing the following week. Saw Omura-sensei hung it in the hallway, between the watercolor of the mountains and the charcoal portrait of someone's grandmother, and I walk past it every morning on the way to homeroom. It's a harbor at low tide, late afternoon. The light on the water is right. Not perfect, but right. The depth visible through the surface shaped by what's beneath it, both things true at the same time. Kyoko Mamiya walks past it 2 steps behind me. She doesn't comment on it. She watches the hallway ahead with the same contained, precise attention she brought to the classroom on the first day. She eats her lunch alone most days, or across from me on the days when I sit across from her. She has not explained herself further, and I have not asked her to. The explanation is available in what she did. Parameters may change again. When they do, I will be there. She will be 2 steps behind me. That's all there is. Not a victory speech, not a conclusion with clean edges. Just a fact, held plainly, after you've finished being afraid of it. The girl who didn't want any of it discovered that wanting is not actually the variable. What you want changes. What you are doesn't. What you do with what you are, that's the part that's up to you. I am Asuka Kami. Covenant is mine. The marrow knows what to do. The light gets in.